Hey guys, it's Dan here. Today I want to talk to you about mixing philosophy and more specifically getting clearer mixes. The problems that a lot of people have when they're starting out mixing usually center around just instruments fighting each other and just really struggling to get that clarity in the mix. I've got an approach which was shown to me by a producer, and I've seen a few other people do this before. It's the way a lot of audio mixers and post-production people work in the industry. If applied correctly, it will make your mixes clearer. If you're a little bit overzealous with it, like I was when I first got it, and I was worrying a little bit too much about making sure that every single instrument had its own space, that can be quite crippling. Later on, I'm going to touch on a way of thinking about that, which really freed me up and enabled me to concentrate on the mix and not have to think about these things too much. You shouldn't have to think too much when you're mixing. It should just be concentrating on what hits you emotionally and makes you feel good. I tend to mix fairly clean. I want to be able to hear each of the individual instruments. Of course, you pick and choose the ones that you want. I think a lot of the best mixes are actually those where the instruments are not necessarily competing with each other. There's a bit of a skew in the way that the instruments are working together, but where you can still actually hear each individual instrument. Okay, so I'm assuming that you've pretty much laid the groundwork for the mix. You've done your editing. You've done a basic EQ where you've pulled out frequencies that were horrible. And you're now ready to add your compression, some more EQ, some effects, those sort of things, to pull the pieces of the puzzle together so that what you end up with is something that people want to listen to and it's replete. Obviously, when you're working on an individual instrument, you want it to sound amazing. And of course, you can get lost pretty quickly working on an instrument, listening to it soloed, and basically out of context to the rest of the mix. And what you find is that when you put these things together, they just don't work. Wouldn't it be great if you could get the sounds that you wanted and then not have to compromise the timbre of the instrument too much in order to fit it in with the rest of your mix? One of the ways that I like to do this is by thinking of the full spectrum, and that's from 20 hertz all the way up to 20 kilohertz, and having that sliced up in a way that each individual instrument is going to occupy mostly one of those frequency bands. And so generally speaking, in the spectrum, you'd have the bass drum, you'd have the bass guitar, you'd have guitars, keys, vocals, kazoo. No, just kidding. Things like hi-hats, cymbals. And you've got to fit things in there like your tom-toms, your snare drum, of course, because I'm also a drummer. You know, depending on the genre that you're mixing, your bass might be down there. So how are you going to get those guys not to clash with each other? Well, first and foremost, I think what you need to do is not worry about how they're going to fit together, but instead identify the instruments that are going to be fighting with each other. And not overthinking it, because I think you can think, oh my God, the tom-tom's going to clash with the bass guitar because you've boosted it down that area. Is it actually clashing? You know, it might be a problem, but it might not be. If it is a problem, is it something that you could have fixed in recording? Was it a tuning issue with the tom-tom itself? When you got to that point in the song where the drummer hit the floor tom and the bass player was playing in E, you know, was it tuned to an E or something in the same scale? These sorts of things are really important. Leaving that aside, I encourage you to trust your ears and pick out the instruments that are fighting with each other in the spectrum. And once you've identified these, you want to find the point on the spectrum where you think the instrument sounds awesome. And on the competing instrument's EQ, you're going to cut that. On the instrument you want to feature, you're going to boost that. And by doing this on all the instruments that are competing with each other, you're going to carve out a space for those instruments and they'll shine through in the mix. And so what you end up with is that certain slices of the spectrum belong to certain instruments. Of course, these instruments will still have parts of their sound which can spread quite wide across the spectrum. A snare drum, for example, is in a lot of those octaves. But what you're doing is enabling it to feature on the part of the spectrum which you think it sounds best. And so what I like to do is EQ each individual instrument, whether it be a snare drum, a hi-hat, a bass guitar. Get it sounding as good as you can and bus it to an auxiliary, or bus all of the guitars to an auxiliary or all the drums to an auxiliary. So you've got it sounding as good as you can. And then what I like to do is basically do the final EQ for the mix on the bus. And so doing it this way, you're compromising the sound that you love, but you're not having to compromise it too much because of using this method. Additionally, and something which really freed me up, was thinking about sounds in terms of their time values. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean, is it a transient? Or is it a sustained sound? Is it like a trumpet playing a long note, a bass guitar holding a note, a guitar playing a power chord? The distinction between these two things can make quite a difference to how you mix with these, because when you're talking about a transient sound, it's something that's going to cut through and then disappear. And so if you do have, say, a transient sound and a sustained sound, which are occupying the same part of the spectrum, it's actually not that important that you move them out of the way of each other. What you'll find is that you actually don't need to do that. And this makes a huge difference in terms of what you actually need to worry about. And it's not necessarily to do with the type of instrument. Sure, drums can be transient, but you can tune a floor tom to ring forever. You can also have a bass guitar play something very percussive, like a slap sort of rhythm, or your guitarist could be scratching away, or you can have a horn section doing stabs. These could also be classed as transients. It's not necessarily pertaining to the type of instrument. So the only thing we actually need to compromise in the mix is when we've got two sustained sounds and, to a lesser extent, transient sounds occupying the same frequency space. And so if you've got, say, two vocalists who are quite similar, you have to then choose which one you want to compromise, which one you actually want to feature in the mix for either that part of the song or for the entire mix. You could go in there and you could automate the EQ for only that section. And so what I would do is I would boost in adjacent octaves, selecting the ideal one for the best vocalist. I hope that this enables you to think differently about your mixes and hopefully arrive at a sound much quicker and much clearer without too much fuss. If you have any questions or comments or ideas for other videos you'd like me to cover, please email me at yamahadrums2009@hotmail.com. You can also check out things that I'm working on at www.soundcloud.com/Yamaha Drums 2009. Until we meet again, happy mixing.